Okay, thank you everyone. I think we'll get started. Thank you for your time this afternoon and welcome to Bloomberg Associates webinar for economic development leaders on the topic of accelerating an equitable recovery. My name is Gordon Innes. I work at Bloomberg Associates Economic Development Team. We really appreciate you giving us your time this afternoon. We hope it's going to be a really valuable hour. With my colleagues, Todd Rufo and Lauren Rackison, we'll spend the next hour sharing some insights, some tools and some experiences from colleagues, both at Bloomberg LP and from 3 US cities. Quick by way of background and some housekeeping before we get started. Bloomberg Associates, those of you who don't know, is the philanthropic consulting arm of Mike Bloomberg's charitable organization, Bloomberg Philanthropies. We work with mayors on topics ranging from economic development, our area of practice, to social services, to transportation. And our only goal is to improve the quality of lives of their residents. Following the outbreak of the pandemic last year, we launched an economic response and recovery program to help cities rapidly and effectively respond and work towards recovery. And as part of that program, we created a number of tactical guides containing practical actions, case studies, roadmaps, and templates for municipal economic development teams. And we want to share those resources with you and make them available to you today. So if we quickly look at the agenda for today, we will kick off today's webinar hearing from Eric Kazatsky from Bloomberg LP's Global Research Team. Eric will share some insights and forecasts into the pandemic's damage and recovery trends in US cities. We'll then hear from the experience of a colleague in Atlanta, as well as how the governments in Newark, New Jersey, and Chattanooga, Tennessee are stepping up effective responses. And as I indicated, we'll share some of the smart tools that we've created for you to use in your cities. Before I hand over to Eric, one point of housekeeping. The QA function, question and answer function, will be open for the entire webinar. It's the button that should be on the bottom right of your screen. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please write them into that QA function. We won't necessarily have time to answer all of them during the webinar, but Bloomberg staff will remain on the line for 30 minutes after the webinar, and we'll try to cover as many of them as we possibly can. If we don't get to your question, we will try and send up follow-up emails to make sure that we can address any concerns or questions you have. With that, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Eric Kazatsky. He's head of municipal strategy at Bloomberg Intelligence. Eric, thank you.
Hi, Gordon. Thank you. And thank you for having me today. So this is really exciting. Usually when we go out and talk to clients, it's really in the vein of explaining the municipal market and muni bonds and tax exempt income. So to come here today and sort of talk about an offshoot of that, which is really sort of the down in the weeds recovery and impacts of COVID and the cities that make the municipal market function well, is super interesting. And it really gave me a chance to sort of ruminate on, one, the impacts that COVID has had on cities, on counties, on states, and really the challenges that still lie ahead and what a recovery and a new normal are going to look at. And, you know, sort of looking at the first slide here, if we could, yep, perfect. We can see 4 critical themes that US cities and stakeholders really have to prioritize to get through 2021 and beyond. Obviously, COVID, everyone's been talking about it for the past year. I'll be honest, as a writer and a research analyst, I'm sick of talking about COVID's impacts. You know, as much as we think that we know about the damage that's been done, when you sort of dig into the societal impacts, to the inequality impacts, there's a lot that's not talked about, and we'll touch on some of that today. Stimulus, obviously dollars and cents. How is the new Biden administration going to help recoveries in cities? And really, what does that impact going to have as far as a new normal as we build back better? And that leads us to point number 3, a recovery for all. Employment recovery, something that everyone in the Biden administration is focused on, full employment. President Biden has stated it. Janet Yellen has stated that as a priority. But when we say building back better, I think it gives city officials and state officials an opportunity to think and reflect on what sort of jobs were hit hardest during the pandemic and still continue to suffer, and what full employment may look like on the other side of this when we turn into an endemic or when we put COVID in the rearview mirror, hopefully. And lastly, that new normal. What are cities going to look like in the future? Not just from an employment standpoint, but we've gone through so many sort of growth patterns in a lot of these localities, from recreating green spaces to repurposing commercial real estate to closing down streets for more pedestrian traffic. What's going to stick and what's not, and how is the best way to plan for that going forward in the face of what the federal government is able to assist with. So if we can go to the next slide. So just starting COVID-19, I think something that surprised myself as well as every other research analyst over at Bloomberg Intelligence is just the sheer length of the pandemic. When we were all sort of sent home in the beginning of March 2020, it was with the understanding that we'd be home for 2 weeks and then back. And here I am in a converted shed in my property, and it's really been going on for over a year, and we were not sure what the end point is here. The graph on this page gives a good representation of just sort of the peaks and troughs of the infection cases across the US. Certainly not a surprise for anyone working in local government as you're dealing with it on the front lines. But I just want to highlight the fact that every time you sort of think that you get to the eye of the storm at the end of this, there's a surprise, another peak lying in the future. I think some things to be aware of, especially as we think in terms of how vaccines are going to help all of us move forward, is just what the surprise element that different variants may have going forward. And I think that's something to really keep an eye on from a city planning perspective. Should we use these lulls and sort of these peaks and troughs to sort of deploy more resources to hardest hit areas in our communities to sort of prepare for the inevitable next spike? And, I think thankfully for those in the northern part of the country, we're heading toward that point where the days are getting longer and warmer weather might be on our side. So it gives us a really nice chance to sort of plan for the fall and the inevitable spikes that we'll see again. If we can go on to the next slide. I think one of the biggest stories that really came out of COVID is just the uneven impacts that the pandemic has had. And there's a nice visual here, just showing the intersection of the impacts of COVID-19. And really the biggest impact center has been those who were least prepared to deal with this from a public health perspective and a financial perspective. Those have really been hurt the most. And we have an employment chart coming up that will really hit that home as well. And I think the best way to say this is the pandemic has had asymmetrical impacts. That's not only across cities, it's across counties and states. But I think the one bright side that has come out of this is that we've seen, at least on the local level, that policy responses have been really quick. And a lot of it has been trial by error, but some of it has been successful. And we've seen some of the success come on, the deployment of vaccines, sort of taking that last mile approach to delivery, but also even in reshaping educational delivery platforms as well. So really, hats off to those working in the public sector on the front lines of this, that they really have proven resiliency. I think something that, is a point that we hit home with a lot of our clients as well, is that this has really started off as a health crisis, but it's devolved into an economic and social shock. So, I think while the Biden administration is looking at how stimulus can impact and help on the local level, the fact remains that some of these revenue streams might be forever changed. And I think that's something that the new administration is really trying to tackle and think long term, as far as it might not just be 1.9 trillion of new stimulus. It might be something to sort of reshape how money is delivered to the local level. As I said, the crisis has exposed inequality across people and places, especially in large cities where minority groups are hardest hit. And I think the thing to keep in mind, though, on the other side of this is that the pandemic will lead to greater changes from city planning to digitalization and even preparedness, as we said. And I think some of this, we'll touch on at the end, is just what that new normal will look like and what the cities of the future will have in store for everyone. Next slide, please. So obviously we did like a deep drill down to look at the societal impacts, but if we sort of take a 10,000-foot view, there's also been an uneven impact across just cities in general and their fiscal outlooks. Some were very ill prepared with low reserves coming into the pandemic, some better than others. I think one bright story that has really emerged in the past couple of weeks is that when we got a view of full year tax collections, they weren't as bad as what we originally thought. I remember looking at municipal finances in April of last year and thinking that the world was coming to an end. But as we sort of got further into the year, we saw tax collections weren't as bad as they once were thought to be. While that's a positive, again, I go back to my point that the stream of revenues that a lot of cities depend on will probably look a lot different. And one example I can give is the city of Philadelphia. City of Philadelphia depends very highly on work revenue from those who commute into the city for income taxes. With so many people in work from home situations, I think that's going to be a challenge for cities like Philadelphia to reshape how they're structuring their general fund revenues going forward if they're not going to have the same volume of workers coming into the city. And again, that's a theme that we're going to hit on throughout this presentation. We can go to the next slide. So I think one thing, again, to sort of keep in mind is the de-densification, right? We talk about what the pandemic's biggest theme has been sort of social distancing, and we really see that playing out in city centers across the US. And that data is supported by U-Haul moving data. It's supported anecdotally by cities like Austin reporting a huge influx of people coming in. But I think more importantly, it's supported in the granular data. Residential rents are down, commercial rents are being hit. And according to big firms who look at this on an annual basis, PwC and Schroders, they've all signaled permanent change into a hybrid office mode. So that means the city centers are changing forever. And that's something to keep in mind, as far as how is delivery of services going to keep going forward. Next slide, please. Vaccine rollouts, these are the key to bouncing back. Only 4 states have reached more than 10% of their populations. It doesn't seem like an impressive number, but that is growing day by day. And to give you some granularity on the city stage, New York City has about 11% of their population vaccinated. Texas, on the other hand, with some cities like Houston and Austin, about half of that. So still a lot of work to be done on the local level, but cities are definitely taking charge and sort of leading the efforts and getting everybody back to a new normal. Next slide, please. No surprise here, the areas hit hardest by shutdowns are really the ones that are going to rebound the soonest. And really the tourism industry and the service industry are just absolutely decimated when it came to job losses. And the disproportionate amount of people who worked in those industries really may not have jobs to come back to on the other side of this. And this just gives you some statistics here. Employment surrounding large airports shows that Las Vegas had 31% of employment dependent on tourism, followed by Orlando at about 18%. So really startling figures about how city leaders in those areas are going to struggle to get people back to work. And I think one of the ways that you can do this is to sort of think, what are the jobs of the future going to be? Will it be preparing for shovel-ready jobs in the construction field as an infrastructure plan comes along? Or will it be more digitalization and tech-oriented jobs as cities of the futures begin to develop? And the next slide, please. Obviously, Biden's 1.9 trillion stimulus plan is going to be impactful, but again, I go back to the point, we don't think this is where it's going to end. Just some figures to throw out there, and you're all probably familiar. 350 billion for state and local governments, 20 billion for public transit, 170 billion for schools, and that's split out 135 for K through 12 and 35 for higher education. The good news is that a lot of the cities and states, their tax collections hasn't been as bad. So a lot of this money can go into rebuilding public transit efforts, in addition to the 20 billion that's already dedicated for that area right there. It can also go to projects to support public housing and to support job retraining initiatives. So this should really be a nice running start for a lot of city governments to sort of refocus their efforts, before the next wave of infections hits. Next slide, please. So another area of stimulus is still in flux is really sort of an effort to reduce inequality in cities. Anywhere talking from additional direct stimulus checks, which has varied anywhere from $2,000 to $1,400, but increased child tax credits, and also discussions about more radical changes has been discussed in recent weeks. And these are taking the form in something that could one day sort of look like universal basic income, where they're sending direct monthly benefits to families and children who are under the poverty line. So it is something to think about, that the administration is really focused on bringing up the bottom portion of the population so that they're not as at risk as they once were before the pandemic. Next slide, please. Pathway to employment is key. State and local governments have lost more jobs in the great financial crisis. And the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic has been on small minority and women-owned businesses. I think something else to keep in mind is many of these businesses were traditionally non-banked. So it's imperative that cities focus on on the local level, trying to recreate what the federal government has done with PPP loans and making sure that the lifelines for these businesses who are critical in their neighborhoods will have the ability to borrow when they need to. Next slide. We talked again about return to fuller employment and equitable employment. Unemployment disproportionately impacted people of color in the service and hourly jobs, which we pointed out in the tourism slide. The sad thing is many jobs won't return. But again, I think the focus for many city leaders will be how to retrain those employees for the jobs of the future. Next slide, please. And what is needed? Focused support for heavily impacted industries in hospitality and leisure. And I think the focus really needs to be on re-educating, retraining, repurposing with the eye for the future. It's a theme that we've said a bunch of times already, but I think the critical thing here is that when we talk about cities of the future and how technology is going to be accessed, now is the time to start planning and dedicating resources to that. Next slide, please. A confluence of low rates and increased liquidity in the markets has also improved housing, but not for everybody in the city centers and not for everybody in the population. So when we talked about prioritizing housing programs for lower income individuals, this is exactly what we're talking about. And one example we cited is Atlanta, where the homeownership rate's only 45% of the national average of 63%. So while there has been this sort of K-shaped recovery, we're really not seeing it on an everybody is participating basis. Next slide, please. Pandemic has highlighted gaps in the system. One thing for city leaders to focus on as we get on the other side of this is ensuring healthcare delivery to those who lack primary care physicians is something that's not going to happen on the other side of this. Safety net hospitals will become extremely important when we come on the other side of this pandemic. There were ones that were struggling with funding going into this. I think that will reverse course. And this is also just going to focus on removing barriers and allowing everyone to take part in the recovery. Next slide, please. Workforce retraining, telecommuting, and real estate changes are going to be the biggest themes in 2021 and beyond. And the rapid shift from work from home has been a complete disruptor. We expect telecommuting to become the normal going forward. And I think that it will give a lot of employees the flexibility to work in communal environments, but I do not think that's going to be in city centers. We will see suburban sprawl once again, which is a theme that we're talking to our clients about on the research side. Next slide, please. And preparing for your city's future. Just by the numbers, $2.5 trillion is expected to be the market value for what global smart cities are going to be sort of investing in the new infrastructure going forward. As we can see here, it's going to include public-private partnerships to get on board and deliver these services, development and deployment of additional digital-based services and infrastructure. We see this happening right now with public transit systems moving to mobile card systems instead of paying at the actual point of purchase. And the development of digital ecosystems in and around the city's digital infrastructure. Again, I'm partial to Philadelphia, but I can point to them doing a great job of already being in the forefront of moving forward with this, from parking to mass transit. Next slide. And going green. I think this is important. If you're preparing and you're planning to go forward and lobbying the Biden administration for assistance and even your state and county governments, I think recognizing that green and renewable energy is a major focus of the Biden administration will sort of help you plan projects going forward. And some of these trends that we've seen during the pandemic are actually, we don't see them being reversible. And we could cite New York City as having a 38% reduction in CO2 emissions from before COVID. I don't see that being a trend that's going to reverse. There's really going to be a move to keep these streets that have been closed to car traffic, and the restaurant industry may have a more European look with street dining as we hit a recovery stride. Next slide. And a recovery for all by all. Cities by themselves are unable to fix the magnitude of change needed. And this is really going to take a team effort, and that's coordinating with county governments and state governments as well. I think that's one of the positives we saw come out of some of these federal programs, where at first they were leaving it up to the states to sort of dictate who the winners and losers would be as far as disbursement of money. And they corrected course on that going forward, directing more of that money to actual city individual borrowers. So we think that some coordinated effort will come in the hands of the sort of teamwork here to get everybody on the other side. Next slide, please. and key takeaways and next steps. Obviously, the recovery will be uneven, but it's really going to depend on vaccine rollouts, the local industry mix, how heavily dependent you were on some of these harder industries, wealth metrics, and home ownership rates. And the immediate priorities for city officials should be lobbying to make the stimulus package more targeted for your needs, plugging the gaps with federal funding, recognizing the changing landscape, greater remote workforce, accelerated digital technology, and aligning with your federal and state partners, and also training and placing residents into the jobs for the future to recognize where you need to be when everything returns to the new normal.
Great, Eric. Thank you very much. A huge amount of information there, a lot of insights. Insights into the impacts the pandemic's having, the war chest coming from the Biden administration, cities, what cities are going to look like in the future, and priorities for action. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time. I know there's been a couple of questions. If we can share these slides, your slides, and also the recording, we will find a way to do that for you afterwards. Please do remember the QA function is open. So if you have questions for Eric, any of the points that he raised, then please put them into the QA and he will be able to stay on and to address those at the end of the webinar. I'm going to move swiftly on, hand over to my colleague, Todd Rufo, who will introduce our speaker from Atlanta. Todd.
Thanks, Gordon. I'm Todd Rufo on the Economic Development Team here at Bloomberg. I'm thrilled to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Eloisa Klemenich, the President and CEO of Invest Atlanta, the Economic and Workforce Development Agency for the city. Eloisa served in this role for 4 years. She's led the development of Atlanta's first ever economic mobility strategy, forged the merger of Invest Atlanta and the city's Workforce Development Agency, and overseen the creation and retention of more than 45,000 jobs. Eloisa is going to share how Atlanta is creating an inclusive economic recovery. If you have questions for Eloisa, please send through the Q&A tool. Eloisa will respond to your questions during the QA session immediately following the webinar. With that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Eloisa.
Thank you so much, Todd. I really appreciate it. And it's an honor, and I'm really excited to be here today. But first and foremost, I want to take some personal privilege and request that together we just have a moment of silence in honor of all our family members and friends and acquaintances that have lost their lives to COVID. For me, I've never lost so many loved ones in a month. So just want to remember them and all of yours and take this moment of silence. Thank you, and my prayers and virtual hugs to you and your family. But I am here today to do what our grandmothers or my grandmother told us, that is, take lemons and make lemonade, to find the positive in all the negative around us. And in other words, to speak about the positive programs and initiatives that have come about as a result of our reaction to COVID. I have the privilege of leading one of the most professional economic development teams that I know. And now I look back a year, COVID, yes, it's almost been a year. I realize the success really is going to require the following. It's gonna humility, nimble, innovative, and really putting our grit to work. So when I think about humility, I think back to February 2020. And I remember the first conversation I overheard about COVID. I was at Old Navy and buying a pair of jeans, and I overheard one of the workers say, I think the store is going to close due to this COVID thing. In my mind, I thought, no way, they're just crazy. Wrong. About 2 weeks later, I decided to follow in the city's footsteps, and we actually closed the Invest Atlanta office. I thought for sure we would be at home for what, 2-3 months? Wrong again. So what I quickly learned is that I was continually wrong. Hence, I decided to be humble enough to realize that there are things I just cannot control. So just recognize that and focus on what I can, which brings me to the second point of being nimble. In March of 2020, the team and I recognized that whatever this was, business revenues were being hit and at a really fast rate. So we looked at our tools and said, what could we do? And we pitched a loan fund to the city council. They agreed. By the end of March, we had our first loan program implemented. Truly, we did not know the long impacts of COVID, but we knew we had to do something. The team got to work and we were able to provide 56 loans to businesses at 0% interest with no payments for 6 months. Since then, all of those loans have turned into grants. Innovative. The CARES Act monies, when it came down, and I remember those first days, and I'm sure you do too, again, did not know what we were going to do, but I began a pitch helping our small businesses, called the team together. Let's create a grant. So we began the brainstorming, $50,000 grant to cover, 40,000 would cover CARES Act impacts and 10,000 for technical assistance. When the team recognized that the businesses in Atlanta that were in our underserved communities had not gotten the first round of PPP assistance, so we focused on them. So we created this program targeted on those businesses that were in our South Side or our lower income neighborhoods. Truly, I am so grateful for the CARES Act because in our history has Invest Atlanta been able to disperse $18 million to over 550 businesses in less than 6-7 months. 66%. I am so proud. 66% of all the funds went to minority and women-owned businesses. Talk about building the plane and flying it at the same time. I know we can relate. Grit. Lastly, I would share putting your grit as an individual and a team to work is at the core of our success. As a team, it was finding new ways to communicate, new ways to deliver services.
We may have lost you here a little bit, Louisa. We'll wait for you to come back in. Looks like we may have lost Eloisa here due to a bad connection. But maybe what we'll do is we'll just go, if she gets her connection reestablished, we're gonna bring Eloisa back in. But maybe we can go back to the slides and I can go on to the next segment. We'll bring Eloisa in as soon as she's back on. So one thing I want to spend a few minutes talking about is that as part of our COVID-19 response, we at Bloomberg Associates developed a straightforward set of how-to tactical guides on topics we heard from our clients are critical for an equitable recovery. One of the things that we really focused on and heard from them very clearly was the need to have practical, tangible guidance on how to address the challenges that we're seeing today. So we developed guides on inclusive small business support, alternative sources of economic development funding, supporting youth, displaced, unemployed, and unemployed workers, business retention, and much more. On many of these guides, we partnered with leading organizations, including LISC and New American Economy. All the toolkits are completely free on our website, bloombergassociates.com, bloombergassociates.org/resources. I can get the next slide. Now, each guide provides a concise set of recommended actions based on effectiveness, equity, and impact. Each action is backed by practical case studies drawn from real-world programming and projects from across the US and internationally. Our goal with these guides is to help local economic development officials like you de-risk and deploy these proven interventions. That's why we also included detailed step-by-step guides for adapting these approaches in your city. And we also included implementation templates, tools, and other resources to save you time. Can I get the next slide? We on the economic development team here at Bloomberg, we're former government economic development practitioners ourselves. We know what it's like to have to develop, deploy, and scale new programming under challenging circumstances. And that's why we designed these guides to help you identify real-world solutions and help you deliver them faster and more efficiently. Check them out, bloombergassociates.org/resources. And if we've got Eloisa back, let's go back to her to continue her talk.
All right, thank you so much. I'm sorry I lost you. I don't know what happened with the internet. You gotta love this COVID. I am going to assume, we're gonna do this live, that I left off on the final one. And this is, I guess, where I'd like to disclose, and I apologize for my internet. Lastly, I'd like to share putting your grit as an individual and a team to work is at the core of our success as a team. It was finding new ways to communicate, new ways to deliver services, and new ways to moving the needle. which brings me at the heart of today's conversation about lemonade, about how you make your grandmother's lemonade. What are we going to do in the future, and how are we going to bring about change in 2021 and beyond to accelerate an equitable recovery? There are many tactics at Invest Atlanta, but we're going to speak about 5 that I'm going to highlight. First, it's the integration of the workforce system, WorkSource Atlanta. Can you imagine how powerful it will be to braid our workforce programs and our economic development and business attraction programs? We have all been in the front lines of our councils and our commissioners. And what's the question that they ask us? But how many of those jobs are going to people in my city or in my district? And how about our training programs? The only way I believe to bring about lasting change to family is training and empowering them with the skills to earn a higher wage. In other words, at the core of equity is workforce development. And with this merger, we're going to coordinate this approach. The second we're going to focus on is equity-driven incentives. We have created an E3, Equitable Economic Empowerment, which means all businesses are welcome to the city of Atlanta. But those that are interested in our incentives must also commit to equity. It's about giving back to our citizens and how we are holding businesses to the challenge and asking them to join us in our equity efforts. We believe this is a win-win. Third, greater small business support. Traditionally, Invest Atlanta has focused on debt financing, recognizing we can't do everything, although at times my staff will tell you I try. We are expanding our partnerships to provide businesses with the wraparound services they need to be successful. We have tripled our goal on the number of businesses we are going to try to support, because supporting minority businesses means we are changing the lives of the owners and their families. It's all about financial empowerment. Fourth is access, making access easier. All our core courses now are online. This has never been done before. On average, we went from serving 280 potential homeowners to 680 in 2020. We saw that same impact in our small businesses, who are now, on average, we're at 88 a month, and now 174 businesses a month are joining us online. So making everything accessible. And lastly, is we will implement the One Atlanta economic and equity strategy. This strategy works on every level of the organization, and we are a part of an accountability to each other's success and the city's success. The strategy lives in every metric of the organization and our individual key performance. And if I can, I'd also like to call out the Bloomberg team. This team is amazing. Todd, Gordon, and Clara, we are lucky to have you in the city of Atlanta. Thank you for your support. Let me close with this thought, and again, this challenge to you and to us. When post-COVID comes, and it's going to come, let's use this opportunity for a reset. Let's all look back and see the lemonade we created, and let's make more. Heck, maybe we even create a lemonade stand. Remember those? Let's take this opportunity to fundamentally change what we do and how we deliver services by focusing on the communities, Black and Brown, that have historically been impacted. We need to ask ourselves, are we prioritizing these communities in our grants, our loans, and our service programs? If not, what change can we take during this reset to do so? Now is the opportunity. Don't just come back to the office as is or as was policies. Let's come back as a new improved work environment where we serve those who need it the most. Let's come back to our national lemonade stand, if you remember, and let's welcome everyone so that we can have happy customers and the best lemonade, which you can't see because I'm on, the best lemonade this country has ever seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Eloisa. I'll take some of that lemonade for sure. It was really great hearing from you. And thank you, Todd, for that exciting teaser about the many insightful resources we have on the BA website. Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Rackison from Bloomberg Associates, and I have the pleasure of leading a fireside conversation with Candy Johnson and Allison Ladd. Candy Johnson is the president and CEO of the Urban League of Greater Chattanooga, formerly senior advisor to the mayor of Chattanooga. So she has the great vantage point of being able to talk to us about being from the driver's seat at City Hall and now moving to a key partner in implementation. And thank you. We have Allison Ladd, who's the deputy mayor, director of the Department of Economic and Housing Development for Newark. So Candy, we keep hearing representation matters and how essential it is to apply it widely within really everything that we do. While you were with the city of Chattanooga, you immediately responded to the crisis by creating an economic recovery alliance to build a stronger, more equitable economy. And a key part of putting together that alliance was representation. Could you tell us a bit more about that decision and how the task force drove your project prioritization?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you to the Bloomberg team for all the support provided to us. We would not be where we are today without those toolkits, I will say that. So yeah, I mean, when you think about representation, for those of us in government, you see the same likely partners at the table all the time. And we have been intentional in the Burke administration about inclusive and equity-centered practices. So that had always been a priority. However, when you think about recovery and you think about bringing economic developers to the table and those who are working in, healthcare and policy to, number one, control the spread of the virus, you may not think about those unlikely partners who have the real answers to inclusive recovery. And so that's what we, immediately led with. We said, who are those faith-based leaders? Who are those neighborhood level leaders? Who are some of the individuals that we should bring to the table to start readdressing? Because many of these issues of disparities and inequities we had already been talking about for many years with our, upward economic mobility planning and some of those other areas, but we had just not been able to deliver at the level that we're going to take it to now with rebuilding, a more inclusive and equitable economy. So yeah, if you don't focus on having the appropriate representation within your community, you could really unintentionally create plans to solve the wrong problems. And we didn't want to do that because we had spent, probably the last 4 or 5 years really addressing the research, which Bloomberg also brought that to the table. And so it just elevated the need to say, we have to do something to address historical disinvestment in Black and Brown communities. And you could not be afraid to put that on the table and say, yes, we're talking about African-American community investment and Latino community investment. And so that's what we were able to do with that small steering committee that we brought together to really set the agenda and set the vision for rebuilding a stronger, more resilient and inclusive economy. So representation was a huge part of how we landed on the initiatives that we did around building a small minority business, specifically focused on African-American businesses, ecosystem, and then also our community education hub, which I think we'll have a little more time to talk about.
You bet. We can all certainly relate to that, Candy. Allison, we're talking a lot about equity today. Newark, particularly under Mayor Baraka, really embeds equity in everything that you do. Can you talk about how you've pursued an equitable response and recovery to the COVID crisis and how you all saw housing and small business as a key piece of that?
Sure, great. Nice to see you, Lauren, and great to be on this fireside chat with Candy. Excited to talk with everybody who I know is across the country, and really glad to be part of this conversation. So here in Newark, Mayor Baraka, he leads with equity. He started far before I joined his team back in 2018 when he created a Newark Forward blueprint for equitable development here in our city. And that blueprint really focused on a lot of principles around collaboration, including education and working to ensure that equity was part of the fabric of our development, both housing and commercial and industrial across our city. So Newark Forward was our vision to begin with, and I was fortunate enough to be part of the team that gets to execute it. So when COVID came to us a year ago, similar to Atlanta, we had to pivot. We had to think quickly about what do we do about COVID impact to our small businesses, our renters, and our residents here in the city. And equity was the main principle throughout that entire thread. So what did we do here in Newark? We decided that when COVID came in March, that right away we would create 6 interventions for $6 million using local funds. And those interventions would help primarily our small businesses, our arts and cultural organizations, our nonprofits, and our renters, because we are 78% renters here. And so we knew that this health pandemic was going to impact our residents, our Black and Brown residents, more than anyone else in the state. So Mayor Baraka led. He led boldly, he led with equity, and he said to us as his team, I need you to find solutions. So we created grant programs, we created opportunities for people to be able to access dollars that they wouldn't have accessed because of COVID and because we were shut down for 3 months like other places were across the country. So what I'd say here is that a key takeaway, though, is that as we work through these interventions, we learned something along the way. A year later, we do things differently. We just announced 2 new programs in the last 60 days. And with the help of the Bloomberg Associates team, we were able to actually pivot some of our scoring criteria to focus more on our hardest hit communities, our MBE and WBE businesses, and really ensuring that they thrive through this pandemic. So Equity Newark Forward is so much of a part of what we do here in the city of Newark under Mayor Baraka's leadership. So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Allison, and great that we can be helpful. Candy, to get out of this recession, we know that it's imperative to move displaced workers to meaningful employment, which often includes retraining in key sectors, something that Eric touched on earlier. You saw that low-skilled jobs were expected to account for about 69% of job losses at the end of 2020. And of course, you know the entrenched barriers to entry for folks without a secondary degree. As a result, you launched the educational hub pilots for residents to obtain credentials of value so that they could move onto a more effective career pathway, touching on a lot of the learnings from our inclusive small business and workforce development tactical guides. You also brought these hubs to the residents themselves using a hybrid virtual in-person model. Could you tell us a bit more about this program?
Yeah, so one of the issues that we saw with former delivery models for adult learners was access to the campus, which was outside of the core, the urban core in our city. And so, we started to, look through those toolkits and say, how do we, and I think Eloise said that, being able to deliver services differently. So how do we bring the education to the neighborhoods? So through partnerships with Chattanooga State, who's our community college, we looked at building out these education hubs that provided wraparound supports. We're still working on the funding for some of them, but based on the industries that we knew would lead in the recovery. And so that's another piece of data that we were able to pull from some of our Bloomberg reports that were provided. And so IT was one of those areas, looking at how do we build, Google IT support certification technicians. That is a job that is on a path to a living wage. And so how do we help more families become more economically mobile, those who have been displaced, who had lost jobs, because we are in a region where we have hospitality, tourism, restaurant, as most of the nation saw the devastation with those businesses closing. So how do we tap into those individuals, and rightfully so, with organizations who were already trusted and working directly with those populations? And so instead of having the institution say, hey, we have these opportunities for these apprenticeships and for you to get education, how did we tap into our faith-based community to say that some of your congregants are needing more help? Let's put them in these education programs to get them more credentials of value, and then also partnering with our local workforce to get them back to work. And so the concept is longer term. That's one of the things that we wanted to prioritize as well, was not to have these short-term programs, to look at this as an opportunity to change the way we serve residents who had already been left out of prosperity in the city because of lack of access. Again, that's getting to the university or having the childcare. We're implementing the earn while you learn. So individuals getting paid at the same time while they're taking the classes, and then put them in a job opportunity. And so that was really important for us. Of course, we could have worked on a lot of different projects, but as Eric said earlier, he said you have to prioritize to get to 2021 through 2021 and beyond. And that's what we did with this community education hub model that ultimately will be a longer term strategy to helping more residents have some type of credential or attainment.
Thank you, Candy. You know, at Bloomberg, we certainly do love that you follow the data to determine your solution and how to hit the most folks. So Allison, as deputy mayor, you have a unique role blending economic development and housing. And then within your portfolio, you oversee development in the city. How has the pandemic affected how you're planning for development past and or present and future for housing and development within the city at large? What advice do you have for other cities?
Sure. So I'd talk about probably 3 areas. One is strategic planning. I think the second is just execution. And the third is understanding where we're headed in the future with the data. So, you know, I think strategic planning was something that I started this position about 18 months ago. And when I got here, I actually met the Bloomberg Associates team. And part of what we started on was embarking on an economic development strategy for the city that focused on the Newark Forward vision. So we really worked together to create a set of goals and tactics and strategies to implement over the next, we were looking at 3 to 5 years. So then 6 months later, here came COVID. Who would have thought, right? So we ultimately had to pivot our entire strategy to focus our efforts on interventions for the people that lived and worked in our city to keep them safe, but also to keep them housed, especially when unemployment was rising. So we pivoted our strategy back when COVID started. But I will tell you now that we are actually pivoting again. We are looking at our strategy for the 3rd time in 18 months to see what do we do now about recovery and how do we do it in an equitable way. And what we know is that the principles remain the same. They didn't change from 2 years ago to today, but what changes is our tactics and our strategies. And so what we're trying to do is ensure that we're able to continue to advance our city despite the fact that COVID's been here for now about a year. The second part I'd say is we have to accelerate our work. Like our city, it's part of the whole, I think, title of our session today, acceleration. We have to accelerate, though, the work that we were meant to do as a department before COVID. We had a pipeline of projects, economic and housing development ones, and we have to execute them now. So it doesn't matter. COVID's here. It's just part of our, parlance. It's part of our existence. We wear 2 masks. We get vaccinated. We get tested. It's just who we are. But we also have to remember that we are also all professional economic development leaders, and our jobs are to help our city recover right now. So part of what I talk to with my team about is how do we recover, how do we do it faster, and how do we accelerate our work that we were meant to do, that we started even prior to COVID. So we've been working to accelerate that work. And I'd say the third thing, though, is data. And I know that the Bloomberg Associates team is going to help us with that because we have to understand what industries, what sectors are impacted more than others. In our city, we have a lot of industrial spaces. We also have restaurants. We have a thriving arts and cultural center that we want to come back. And so in order for us to be able to have the right strategies and tactics for us to be able to help our city and the people recover, we need to understand that data. And so I know that I would encourage all cities and communities that are grappling with this Like, definitely think about all the strategies and tactics you used before COVID, add on all the ones that you did during COVID, and now figure out where we're going to go in the future together. But use the data, because I think the data is going to show us the direction. And that's the piece that I'm counting on the Bloomberg Associates team to help us with as we move forward.
And you know, Allison, we most definitely will, but glad to hear you are following the data. And I also think, you know, it's a testament to what Eloisa said earlier, in being nimble and being able to see your plan in new light and maybe reprioritize, but essentially use the same playbook in terms of what you had set out to do. So unfortunately, as much as I want to keep chatting, we have our last rapid fire question, but that doesn't mean that people can't use the Q&A function and ask our speakers more questions and continue to stay on the line afterwards. But I only have a few more minutes with you both. So as our last rapid fire question, obviously you've learned a tremendous amount coming out of 2020. Could you impart a particular lesson learned and some advice to the other economic development leaders on the call about how they can accelerate a more inclusive, equitable economy moving forward? So whomever wants to go first.
Well, I go back to what Eric shared, and I hope it was Eric that, yeah, it was Eric that shared recovery for all by all. And so when you talk about inclusivity and equity, you cannot do the work well unless you disaggregate the data and you lead with the data, coupled with the real stories of residents. Because sometimes, you know, data tells a story, but when you are able to work at the grassroots level, work alongside your nonprofit partners, realizing that government does not have all the answers alone. To rebuild a more equitable economy in your local communities, it's going to take everyone working together, using the different pieces of data, and leading with that to make investments. You can't look at addressing inequities if you're not willing to make targeted resource investments. And that's monetary, that's, you know, land, that's all the things that were missing before the pandemic that have just been exacerbated. And so now it's time for us to stand up and realize, now, and I'm on the nonprofit side, so we'll be implementing some of these things, but government has the ability to facilitate community leadership. And so continue to keep that in mind, but don't try to own every project. Use the investments that you get and help invest in those organizations like your local urban leagues, like your local United Ways, to help you carry out those initiatives so that they can be longer term and not just short term as you look to recover.
Thank you, Candy. I think that also touches on your point earlier about how essential it is to build the right infrastructure to listen to people, such as you did with the Alliance. So not just using the data, but saying, how does this translate in your everyday for your constituents? And then Allison, we want to hear from you. Love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. I'd say, you know, be intentional about equity. I know it sounds simple, but, you know, we all have been in our professions, and, you know, whether it's a new job or one you've had for a while, where we understand the terminology, you know, equity, equitable, inclusive, like we can say the words, but we are in positions now where we can execute in a way that it actually happens, where results are actually equitable, are looking at ways to help our residents build wealth. And it really is, I believe, our responsibility to do that, but it starts with us. So it's not only just talking about it, it's changing the scoring structure to ensure that you have points for MBE and WBE. It's realizing that you can do an online application, but if your residents have a digital divide and your businesses aren't tech savvy, then they're not going to access the program the same way as everybody else. And it's understanding that there are differences amongst us as people, and we must reach people where they are. So, you know, as much as we know, like we had COVID, we had stay-at-home orders, you know, we have, you know, city halls and governance, we got to get back out into the community. And that, to me, for 2021 is a lot of what I want to do, is be back in the neighborhood, go meet the residents, be with the businesses, understand what the true issue is, and not try to think about it in a vacuum. Understand, like everyone's saying, about talking to partners, but also talking to the people that we're trying to assist, so that we really are helping them where they are and reach the needs that they have. So I think that that's a big part of 2021. And I think that as much as we want to be, I do believe it's a conscious effort every day for us to be intentional about ensuring equity as part of what we do. Thanks.
Thanks, Allison. Obviously, we toss these terms a lot, and it's really helpful to unpack them and really translate them within our local communities and what that means as economic development leaders for our, constituents in our communities. So thank you. If I wanted to give you guys one moment to say anything else before, unfortunately, I have to hand over the baton to Gordon. So if you have any other thoughts, love to hear them, but please do stay on, everyone, for a Q&A at the end. Our speakers will be able to stay for a few minutes, and do use the Q&A function if you have anything else to ask.
Lauren, I will add one thing. I will say, when we got to the committee level of the 2 priority projects that we focus on, the African American business development ecosystem plan, there was a time when you talk about being bold and courageous and having tough conversations, because equity work is hard. It's not easy because it's hurtful to see those disparities and not be in the position to address them. But we are in the position, and one of the things that one of our co-chairs said, she mentioned, she said, let's just stop saying grouping all the minority-owned businesses together when we know that 41% of the African-American business, and this was a national number, are being hit a lot harder and not having the resources, less than 2 weeks of cash reserves on hand. Let's be okay with saying we've got to do something to help the African-American businesses in our community, which is a large part of our 34% of our population. And so for me, that was a rewarding experience, that we had leaders not driven by government that stepped up and said, like, let's be okay with saying African-American in our plan. Like, it's nothing wrong with that. And Bloomberg did just that in many of the toolkits, especially with the immigrant toolkit that we used before the other toolkit came out. And so that was helpful when you are talking about racial equity, being able to be bold and say what needs to be done for which group.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Candy. Thank you. Well, thank you both. This has been really insightful. I've learned a lot, and I continue to be inspired and in awe about the great work that you do and to communities that need it most. So thank you for doing what you do every day. Gordon, I'm going to hand it over to you to close us out, but thank you again, Candy and Allison.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much to all of our speakers. To Lauren, to Candy, to Allison for that session, also to Eloisa and to Eric. I have to say, Candy, Allison, and Eloisa are 3 of the smartest people I've met in this job. So huge congratulations to them for what you've achieved and are achieving in your cities, and thank you for inspiring us today. Let me just wrap up a couple of reminders. Let me please, again, put up the URL for the toolkits. Encourage you to download them, to look at those. We spent a lot of time scanning around the country internationally for proven and promising practices, case studies, step-by-step guides, templates, do's and don'ts, and we hope that those are going to be really helpful. Please feed back to us if you're using them, if you find them helpful, if there's anything else that you would like those to cover. Do keep going back to the website. We're adding new toolkits at the moment. Next month, we will be adding a toolkit around real estate, how to respond to the real estate market and what's happening there at the moment. And we're also doing work in the next month on rebuilding local tourism economies. So again, go back to the website for those toolkits in due course. We've also put up our website, our email address there. Please feel free to reach out to me, to my colleagues, if there's any questions, either about the toolkits or the topics discussed today. We will find a way to make both this recording and the slides available to you. So I know that has come up in the QA. I hope it's been a very valuable webinar. I hope you've been inspired. I hope you will find the information we've provided really, really helpful to make a difference in your communities. We're looking forward to continuing to support you further in 2021. As Lauren indicated, we will stay on the line for a few minutes to answer the questions that are in the QA. So if you can stay on for that, fantastic. We look forward to chatting with you. If not, please stay safe. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and goodbye.
And we'll now begin the Q&A session and just go through some of the questions that we got through the QA tool. First off, from Tony to you, Eloisa in Atlanta. Is Invest Atlanta a certified Cdfi community development financial institution, or do you promote your loan programs through lending partners?
We are actually an authority, so we have a special statute in the Constitution that allows us to exist, and we do our own loan programs in-house. So we have our own loan portfolio. We have about 12 different loan programs.
Over to you, Eric. Mike was asking about the need for rapid retraining. He mentioned hospitality workers who are out of work now and don't have the luxury to wait. Can you give some examples of successful transitions?
Yep. So getting actual data on what the placement rate has been once workers enter the programs has been a little tricky. It's something that we've been trying to get a hold of for a couple of months and no success. But on the flip side, we can point to some programs that have had decent enrollment and some financial support from partnerships in the community that we could highlight. One key program that we mentioned to Mike was Workforce Solutions Capital Area and Work Now in Austin. They, along with the community college there in Travis County, they've actually created a program to retrain displaced workers, and they set aside about $3.2 million to do that. It's basically a 12-week program that focuses on apprenticeship type work. And the positive thing is folks also receive a weekly stipend when they're enrolled in the program. So overall, very good reception in the area. And Texas, again, sort of leading the way here. Another example is Project Quest in San Antonio, which has a similar slant as far as retraining displaced workers. Look, I think that, we're going to see this more and more as communities sort of get on board, and there's a teamwork type effort to sort of lead forward and making sure that people are getting the right skill set for the economy of tomorrow.
And another one that went to you, Eric, from Lorena about your Recovery for All slide. And she's really focused on, she noted how you were talking about collaboration across all levels of government, but she was really interested in the role of the broader community and the business sector.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think like Eloisa just commented, right, that they're sort of an authority that they could do loan programs and then they have the ability to statutorily lend. I think the question from Lorena really focused on how could the community get involved? And I always view this as more of like a crowdsourcing effort than anything else. And it's interesting. I sort of follow trends in the larger financial industry, and some of that is sort of the disruption in the financial sector. And one of the companies that are sort of leading the way is SoFi and sort of their crowdfunding efforts to get money into the hands of people and sort of think about like a Kickstarter type sense. And I think that, the way to sort of get money into the hands of those who've been traditionally unbanked, and unfortunately they were left out of sort of some of these PPP programs, is really sort of to tap into the greater community's willingness to sort of crowdsource these efforts to quickly and deploy money. I would also sort of ask the other panelists who are on here, like, what are you seeing as far as community efforts in that sort of vein as well?
In terms of loan capital, we're seeing a lot of groups stepping up here. We have several other loan entities or that provide loans, some CDFIs that have really stepped up and are providing loans, from List to ACE. They're providing more loans. The reality is, though, many businesses are saying they can't take on more debt. So it really is, how do you balance the debt and the grants that are out there?
Right.
I would say from our perspective in our community, we put together a resiliency toolkit because, to your point, Eric, so many of these small and minority owned businesses were not prepared or were unbanked or didn't have the proper paperwork to apply. And so our city did a business stabilization fund for small businesses, and we look through the lens of equity to ensure that as well. But I do know that there are multiple nonprofits in our community foundation who are also giving grants. So not just a loan, but providing grants. And we will at the Urban League build back office support to help prepare for the future, whether that be, your accounting and your banking relationships and helping them build social capital for the future.
And I just say here in Newark, it's since we're also naturally part of a state, New Jersey Economic Development Administration has been providing a lot of small business grants. I think they have at least 5 different rounds that have already been awarded here in the state. So they've been able to support our businesses also in Newark just as much as they've been supporting businesses across the state. I'd also say, to Candy's point, I think we also have Invest Newark, and our Invest Newark, our Economic Development Corporation, has really been helping to create back office support and do technical assistance, and also provide different resources for procurement and contracting and other ways to help build businesses, even in a time like now, which we have COVID in front of us. So I think that using our partners, whether they're state or their other local economic development organizations in the city, has helped us try to reach more businesses in need.
And I just echo what Allison said. I mean, the reality is you got to provide the support system and the network around the business. One thing is to give them the loan or the grant, but unless there's that support system enough, it won't be successful for long-term success.
Another question that we got that picks up on that point is, did you find, as you focus your programming around particular populations, whether minority, women, or et cetera, were there tensions that you faced either from policymakers, community, or other community leaders to say, hey, there's a fairness issue there? And if so, how did you approach it?
Well, I can say in Newark, one of the things that we found here was in our first round and second round of small business assistance. The first one was done, April of last year. And so everything was online. We thought that was the safest way to accept applications. And then we learned quickly, though, that a lot of our businesses, that wasn't the easiest way for them to send information to us. So that worked, but it wasn't ideal for all of our businesses here. And then, so the second round, we started accepting things also by mail. Because by then it was later in 2020. And so we weren't reopened yet in Newark because we didn't start reopening until June. But we did realize that we'd also take hard copies and that everything didn't have to be online. And then I'd say the third time around, what we realized is, so 3 times the charm, right? So I think the third time is that we also need to focus on our businesses that needed it the most. And so I know that's probably subjective for different people. And I just end with, for us though, it was our barbershops, our nail salons, our hair salons, our bodegas that were really impacted because they couldn't do things virtually. They couldn't go online, and those are services that you need to do in person. And so I think that was another way we started to pivot our program in our third round.
Allison, can I ask, I know both Newark and I think Baltimore did a lot of work to try to make it easier for small business owners, particularly minority small business owners, to navigate and to make sure that they got their share of the loans and the grants that were going out, as well as the support. I don't want to put you on the spot because this wasn't a government program, but can you say a bit about the Our Fair Share program in Newark and the kind of the intention, the ideas behind that, which was a really kind of creative idea, I thought.
Thanks, Gordon. Unfortunately, I can't speak to it, but so I wish I could, though.
Okay, it's for those still listening, it's ourfairshare.com, which was it was to bring together non-profits, independent contractors, churches and others to try and help to get them processed into the system. So it's to the point around getting them ready with their documentation, etc., and then connecting them, particularly unbanked, and connecting them into financial institutions. So it was one example of many examples of the sort of things we've been talking about, how to tackle equity. Sorry, Alison, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Another question that we got from Jason, this was for you, Eric, but everyone should, I think, respond to this one. Jason was asking about remote work, and Eric, I think you referred to it as the new norm. I think what Jason's asking is, how much is that going to be the norm versus more of a hybrid model where you're working sometime in the office and sometimes not? Or community, I know there's a lot of discussion around community hubs and neighborhood hubs as well. Eric, can you expand on that? And then maybe if our speakers could all share about what they're seeing in theirs.
I think if you think about the evolution of work from home, it was really like the stages of grief, right? You had the denial, the acceptance, and now everyone's just sort of like moving forward with this is going to be the new normal. And I think for me, it became real when we actually saw large clients of Bloomberg announce that this is a thing now. BlackRock, JP Morgan, the people who were recalling people back to the trading floors and there were mass infections happening in the beginning of this, we're now coming around and saying, hey, our work is still getting done seamlessly. We're touching clients. We're hitting record revenues in the face of all these challenges. So I think that, yes, there probably is going to be a hybrid mix, but I come at it from the slant that there's a lot of money being saved in the interim, right? And some of that, and I put on my municipal credit analyst hat, and I'm thinking in terms of all the travel expenditure money that's being saved. And I think that's an area where you're really not going to see a lot of money come back quickly as far as business travel. And that's going to be a negative feedback loop to some of these tourism dependent economies, especially ones that are dependent on convention centers. And there's been a lot of spending on city convention centers and sort of this arms race and trying to get the biggest and fanciest in recent years. And I think that's going to be a real headwind for them going forward. So to answer Jason's question, I would agree that there probably is going to be a hybrid. I think that there's going to be a challenge going forward to try and ever go back to the way it was. But I think that hybrid, as people get more comfortable and the longer time persists, I think you might actually see it be, a 60% at home, 40% in office type mix. I think the challenge will be for cities, as I mentioned before, especially those who depend on city wage tax from, a disproportionate amount of people who come from outside the city. How do you replace those revenues? Because it's not just the revenues for the general fund of the city, it's the SEPTA revenues for people on mass transit in Philadelphia. It's the money being spent by all those people in the city every day getting lunch and getting dinner and getting breakfast and going shopping. So it's really a multi-pronged attack that everybody sort of has to step back and say, how do we change things going forward, knowing that the landscape is different?
Eloisa, Candy, Allison, anything you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, all I would just say for us, I'm sorry, Candy.
No, I was going to say no.
Okay, all I was going to say for us, I knew, at first there was a lot of consternation whether the staff could do this. I think the realization for COVID was if you had problem employee before COVID, you probably still had a problem employee after COVID. So it wasn't because they were working from home. To Tarek's point, people were getting work done. And I think that's a realization. But I'm very concerned about, the people that would clean the offices, the local lunch store, the dry cleaners in downtown. That these are areas that we had already seen some areas light in terms of population, and we all know that we need a concentration of people to be able to turn some of our neighborhoods around or bring them back. And so we're really concerned about what that may look like. So I think it's us trying to think differently now about how we plan our communities.
So we have time for just a couple more questions here that I'm going to grab from the QA. Candy, Thor wants to hear more about your education hubs.
Yes, so as with any community, our chamber was leading some of the workforce development programs, primarily around manufacturing. And Gordon knows I had a little heartburn about, automation of the future, because again, our Economic Recovery Alliance was focused on the future and who were those individuals that would be hurt by the automation in our manufacturing industry. You look Black and brown individuals. And so what we decided to do was really shift and see how do we help individuals who have not had any type of degree or credential persist and complete some type of post-secondary credential. Now, for one, if you are not comfortable using technology, that's a new change for you to talk about not even going into the classroom. But so we decided that we would incorporate what we have called Tech Goes Home, and that is foundational computer skills, and you get a laptop. Our Enterprise Center offers that, so partnering with them to offer just some basic skills, because most of our hub work will be virtually at the Urban League, at another church. And the reason we decided to house these hubs, the city will also have one through their Office of Family and Community Development. So we're all going to partner together to train mentors, community mentors, because that was one of the #1 factors that was listed from a local survey that we had about why individuals didn't go back to get some type of credential was they had an absence of exposure and mentors. Childcare was a big deal as well, especially for those who have multiple children trying to do work at home. How many of you have had college students trying to get work done at home? And so really, again, it's almost like you're creating mini campuses within trusted organizations who actually serve the populations that you're trying to reach, by the way. Some of these, programs that we've had in the past in the community, these institutions may have a hard time getting people to enroll and to sign up. So you have to take a personal approach. That's people in the congregations, that's people, who come to us at the Urban League for direct social services, taking it to the next level, saying, hey, have you thought about getting a credential with the potential earnings of this in these different fields? And so just really intensive case management. And so with the goal of having 2,000 more residents complete some type of new degree or credential by 2024 is the goal that we have been looking at for our community, and bringing multiple partners together. And I'm happy to share, if you email me, I think I emailed, put my email address in there, I will share our actual plan that we are working to implement.
Thanks, Candy. Okay, last question goes to Kareem, who wants to know more, and I think this was to open to anybody, but to know more about programs that are focused on local supply chains or small business networks, and helping to stimulate local purchasing within a neighborhood or local economy. Anyone want to jump in on that one?
I know here in Atlanta, one of the things that we've done is we talked about our changes to our incentive structure. We have a commitment. If you receive an incentive from Invest Atlanta, you'll commit to buying local. And so we're now putting together a network to help some of our small businesses so they can participate. But it really is just tying our incentives to make it motivational for our business.
So I know here in Newark, Invest Newark, our economic development corporation here, created a business portal that's online and worked with Rutgers to ensure that there's more transparency about contracts that are available from our anchor institutions as well as from other businesses. And so I believe that in the first 3 months, the portal has 160 opportunities that were listed on the portal, which is pretty phenomenal. So I know Invest Newark was quite proud of that. And so I think that, and the city is too, because we really are trying to figure out how to get the dollars in the hands of those that are our small businesses, our contractors that are here that are local. So before it was more of a network and conversations that people may have had about what was coming forward, and it wasn't as open, where now this business portal that's on investnewark.org is able to actually connect the businesses to the contracting opportunities.
Thanks, Allison. That is all we have time for. I do want to send a final thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for your time today, for an incredible conversation. I want to thank all of the attendees who took time out of their day to join us, as well as the team at Bloomberg Philanthropies and Associates for their support on today's webinar. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.